Thanks, that's great. I'm delighted to be here and happy for your interest in my book, The Black Woods, Pursuing Racial Justice on the Adirondack Frontier. It's a little-known chapter of New York history, and I'd first written Adirondack history, but of course it's a lot bigger than the North Country. Can't hear me? Got to speak up? You've heard this. You should, poor thing. Okay, anyway. It has links to South Central New York, is this better? Where the great radical abolitionist and land baron Gerrit Smith from tiny Peterborough first dreamed up a plan to give away 120,000 acres of his wild Adirondack land to 3,000 poor black New Yorkers in 1846. It had links to New York City and the Capital District, the Catskills, and the Tug Hill Plateau. Between 1846 and 1852, landless, voteless black New Yorkers from almost every county in New York State got free 40-acre lots apiece from Gerrit Smith. 45 giftees were from Saratoga County. Why did Smith give up this land? An amusing letter to black friends in Manhattan, August 46, the upstate philanthropist gave his reasons. And can you hear me now? Is it okay? So, kind of meh? Okay, I'll shout. 25 years earlier, in 1821, New York voters had overwhelmingly approved a new $250 voter requirement for black New York men alone. If they hoped to vote, they had to show they owned that much in real property. This in the same year that property requirements for white male voters were scrubbed. Black voters saw their suffrage requirement shoot up from $100 to $250, and the property requirement for white men dove from $100 to $0. Poor white men were now full citizens, poor black men effectively disenfranchised, made politically invisible, made mute. And nothing to be done about this, not until the next Constitutional Convention assembled to debate rules of suffrage in 1846. That's a long pull. And in that year, too, as in 1821, convention delegates backed the racialized restriction. Then, in November, New York's all-white voters did too, very emphatically, especially from downstate. Enter Gerrit Smith's very simple visionary idea, quote, "Since the state has determined that black men must become landholders that they may be entitled to vote, they will become landholders," he reasoned. Vote they will, cost what it will. Smith had inherited a load of wild Adirondack land from his father, Peter Smith, an extraordinary land baron in his own right, and to this he'd added much more. But financial crises had brought him close to bankruptcy, and while he survived these challenges, his ambition at mid-century was to minimize his risk. He had tried to sell his wild land, not all of it, but a good chunk of it. Only some of it had sold. He lived too far from his Adirondack property to manage it with care, and his absentee landlordism of so much property did not square with his land reform equalitarian ideals, and it embarrassed him in front of his land reformer friends. This new plan would not just relieve him of a big chunk of his tax burden, it would express a kind of environmental distributive justice. It would offer a home-owning solution for urban black New Yorkers who could not hope for affordable and decent housing in cheek-by-jowl city slums. It would model interracial collaboration and exemplify affirmative action a century before the strategy was named. And it would facilitate access to the ballot. As Smith wrote his black friends in Manhattan, "I know poor white New Yorkers are just as badly off as black people, but white men can vote, black men can't. With these land gifts, I can help redress a racialized injustice. I can try to even out the field." Were any of Smith's gift lots actually worth $250? $50 is really more like it, but over a few years, with steady improvements, a wild lot could gain this value. Sweat equity was part of Smith's plan, too. He could have given bigger gifts, bigger land lots, or just cash that would enfranchise his grantees on the spot, But this was not the point. A bracing wrangle with the, quote, rigors of the Adirondack wilderness, Smith wrote, would work out a far better character than if his grantees had an over-easy time of it, or, as he put it, built their new homes on fat lands under genial suns. Smith had outdistanced the Calvinism of his youth by the time he gave up land, but not his romantic faith in virtuous struggle. New York's northern New York frontier would be, he felt, a proving ground of black manhood. This was the idea. As to this big plan's implementation, here Smith's years-deep anti-slavery network served him very well. He tapped 13 men of prominence in the reform community, some white, most of them black, and tasked them to find grantees who met his terms of eligibility, namely no drinking, good character, poverty, and a New York address. He broke the agents into 4 committees and assigned each committee to its own swath of the state. All of New York State was covered, and then his agents got cracking. Why did they do this? These were busy men with big families, demanding jobs. James McCune Smith, for instance, was one of 2 black physicians in New York City, and each one leading activists on the forefront of anti-slavery and black rights reform. It's true that no black leader at mid-century in New York would have cared to get on the wrong side of Gerrit Smith, a very generous funder of equal justice initiatives, but more than opportunism drove their service here. Some saw a way to realize their own fervent agrarianism. The land agents, the land agent Charles Bennett Ray had been trumpeting black rural husbandry as the solution to urban penury, disenfranchisement, and Jim Crow for years. Life on the frontier, Charles Ray felt, would be an equalizer for struggling pioneers, and if only from necessity, would turn homesteaders, black and white, into grateful cooperative neighbors. The reasoning of Ray's friend and fellow agent, Dr. James McCune Smith, was more empirical. His own study of the impact of city life on black mortality suggested a full-bore migration to a healthy, clean, fresh frontier might save numberless black lives. Smith's friend and fellow grantee, Frederick Douglass, new to New York and not a land agent, promoted Smith's new cause with brio in his paper, The North Star, for the chance it offered to disprove white assumptions about black indolence and incompetence. And from Troy, the militant abolitionist and agent, Reverend Henry Highland Garnett. Has anybody here heard of him? Oh, well, you're missing out. He's a great figure, who gained his name in anti-slavery circles for his 1843 speech that called on enslaved Americans to rebel, rise up, get free, and head north. Garnett had his own starry hopes for Smith's idea. To the grantees would fall the work of, quote, setting an example of independence for black people and demonstrating, quote, the falsity of the old doctrine that we are doomed to be the hewers of wood and drawers of water. God's design that every man shall have a home was theirs to claim, a perfect system of agrarianism, their duty to install. Garnett's Black Woods would be a sanctified utopia, a city on a hill. The land agents flogged Smith's plan at suffrage meetings and conventions in Brooklyn, Westchester, Buffalo, Ithaca, and Troy, at uplift and temperance gatherings, in their anti-slavery newspapers, and by going room to room in the notoriously squalid Five Points neighborhood in Manhattan. White papers in New York, Vermont, even Michigan applauded Smith's scheme of justice and benevolence as well. And by 1852, all 3,000 deeds had their owners, and every deed holder could look forward to building new homes on the frontier. So what went wrong? Read any antiquarian account, and early 20th century reports too, and you will learn in terms here sorrowful, they're mocking, that the giveaway was a rapidly revealed bust. Only 50 grantees came north with their families, bringing the head count to about 200. My math is more elastic, but even when I bundle in the outliers, fellow travelers who got no gift deed but still came north to support the effort, or grantees who settled in the Adirondacks but not in the core districts that interested most people, who did this, or black Southerners who came up with returning Union veterans after the Civil War and eagerly were absorbed into black households already on the ground. Even then, I can't stretch the number to more than 250. Something here failed to compel. Adirondack historians explained it in two ways. Those who figured all the gifties were surely fugitives, since Gerrit Smith had done so much for fugitives, famously so, purchasing their freedom, welcoming them to Peterborough, establishing an anti-slavery political party, and so on, reasoned that the no-show deed holders and the ones who came and left very quickly were congenitally unfit for Adirondack farming. As Southerners, as Africans, they just weren't built for the cold. And never having had to boss themselves, they lacked the necessary motivation, rigor, and resourcefulness to build and run a farm. As the acclaimed Adirondack historian Alfred Donaldson put it in 1922, the attempt to combine an escaped slave with a so-called Adirondack farm was about as promising of agricultural results as would be the placing of an Italian lizard on a Norwegian iceberg. Other historians, a second camp, who understood these land gifts were actually intended for black New Yorkers, also blamed the grantees for their non-appearance because, as city folk with city skills, barbers, tailors, waiters, day laborers, and the like, they lacked the toughness for this hard life. So they beelined back to their urban comfort zone. At heart of both explanations, of course, was a racialized presumption of some essential black incapacity. No fault of theirs, they didn't have the right stuff. Gerrit Smith himself confessed to these assumptions. In 1857, when Horace Greeley, the great newspaper man, asked him to come clean on why his giveaway had failed to pan out, Smith allowed he might have given easier land to break and work. But then he rolls it back. Some farmers managed, didn't they? White farmers made it work, thanks to their, quote, very hard work and very frugal habits. Why, he then asked, considering the character of the colored people, should we expect them to do much in the Adirondacks? The grantees lacked the goods, in other words. His expectations had been too high, and they were, but not because his gifties lacked grit. Smith's expectations were too high because he hadn't done his homework. The land he gave away was useless to giftees without the means to move to it and work it, and this they did not have. Agricultural historians report that the cost of bringing a 40-acre farm into production in the mid-19th century averaged $1,500. This figure was beyond the reach of Smith's grantees, beyond the worth of the land itself, and beyond the means, it should be noted, of white wage earners making $1 to $2 a day. In that tough first year especially, the grantees needed startup funding to get them through, buy livestock, tools, and fund their moves. And this they never had. Further, if they had possessed this kind of startup money, they wouldn't have been eligible for Smith's gifts. Their missing ranks on the frontier might be viewed less as a failure than the opposite. The grantees knew what they could manage, how much they could afford. This Adirondack move risked utter destitution. They also knew, as Smith did not, just where, after the enactment of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, they felt relatively safe. It was not in the unfamiliar, unimaginable, overwhelmingly white Adirondack woods. Add up these disincentives, their disabling poverty, the bad news in Frederick Douglass's paper about devious surveyors and double-dealing guides, and then this new fugitive slave law with its triple threat of pursuit, capture, and re-enslavement, no small risk for black New Yorkers, whether slave-born or not. Remember Solomon Northup. Deed holders had very good reason to stay put in the towns and cities they called home. But let's put Gerrit Smith and his grandiose hopes out of the way and consider for a change the Adirondack experience of these grantees who did come north and from their perspective. Let's take the modest influx of 200, 250 on its own terms. What do we find then? What I found was pretty hopeful. On this underpopulated rough frontier, black families integrated a previously all-white world and more. They challenged racialized ideas about black incompetence and unfitness for Adirondack life. They took on voluntary town appointments as fire watchers, road inspectors, tax collectors, constables. Co-founded a town library, 2 churches, and a singing school. Alex Hazard, a grantee's son in St. Armand, Essex County, guided white sports and hunters into Franklin County's woods and waters, and with his brother helped to organize a village cemetery, integrated like all the Adirondack cemeteries in neighborhoods where black people lived, and like their schools and churches too, unlike the cities that they came from. In North Elba, Lyman Epps cut the first trail through the Indian Pass. The grantee Josiah Hasbrook's son hiked up Whiteface and camped on top of it with his white friends, among them John Brown's children. And Hasbrook, too, guided hunters and worked on integrated farm crews. At land redemption meetings, when poor farmers appealed to redeem their property from state or county tax seizures for unpaid taxes, black farmers vouched for their white neighbors and heard their neighbors vouch for them. No mention of race in these documents. And white neighbors would take their part again when black Civil War veterans who fought with the U.S. colored troops needed affidavits that confirmed their disabilities so they could get their pensions. Oh, and something else. On this frontier, and in stark contrast with the cities where they came from, black pioneers did vote, usually within 2 to 5 years of getting there. Drawn from a range of archival sources, many of them non-digitized, these stories stitch a sampler of daily integrated life on the frontier, social intimacy, and mutual respect. Antiquarian historians didn't look for this or value it. Taking their cue from biased sources and inheriting these biases as well, their view would fix how people understood the Blackwoods for well over a century. Fix and minimize the story even to the point that when black activists their own annual pilgrimage to John Brown's farm in 1922, and it lasted for 70 years, and all that time, they had no interest in the black community that brought Brown to North Elba in the first place, no sense of its roots in a suffrage justice initiative, and no grasp of its generational endurance in the descendants of the grantees in the neighborhood. Now, I don't want to overstate the gains of this very fragile black community. This was no post-racial utopia. Economic advancement for the descendants of these pioneers would never match the progress of the children of their white neighbors. No Smith grantee or son of a grantee served as county supervisor or school board member. And if their farms stabilized and sometimes broke more than even, they would not make their owners rich. In the late 19th century, when the old agrarian subsistence frontier gave way for two bigger consolidated farms pitched to an emerging market, and a new service sector was ministering to hotels, private camps, and exclusionary clubs, the old subsistence farms were stranded. They could not compete, and as costs soared, they lost ground. In the progressive era, they weren't progressing. They went broke and fell from favor, too. The new conservationist discourse in the Adirondack region had little use for stunted farms, black-owned or white, that challenged the aesthetic expectations of excursionists chasing green views and venison in the new Central Park for the world. The optics were all off. And when those farms were abandoned, nature claimed them fast. So in my book are no pictures of Stephen Morehouse, the grantee from Waterford in Saratoga County. The one Saratoga County giftee who moves up is from Waterford. So whoever the historian is in the room, I want to talk to you when we're done. He moved his young family to the new hamlet of Blacksville on Franklin County's Loon Lake. No pictures of his son Warren hunting game birds for white campers in the woods or waiting tables at Paul Smith's fabled Wilderness Hotel. No oval-framed family portraits of the pioneers of Freeman's Home, Timbuktu, or in Negro Brook or Negro Hill, went by both names, sadly. No photograph of William Carusaw and his boys hauling sap buckets to a kettle, or Lyme Epps Jr. an ace shot even as a boy crouched over a buck. These things, like a well-built home, cost money. When pioneers moved away, as most of them would do, what saw boards, notched logs, or cedar shingles escaped the avid foraging of neighbors crumbled into duff. Where stories revealed themselves to me was on the page. Old newspapers, legal documents, school rolls, poll sheets, tax records, military pensions, and deeds led me to the proofs of a resolute black agency unrecognized in the published histories of this chapter. Agency expressed in the fierce pursuit of military pension justice, in voting records, community building, and church going, and in how the agents took Smith's mission and revised it to suit their own. For instance, the perfect system of agrarianism that Reverend Garnett was urging from Troy was more like a perfect system for starvation in the Adirondacks. Not farming alone, but a diversified economy, a little logging, hiring out, service work, guiding. This was how Adirondacks got by then and how many of them do today. John Brown came to the Adirondacks to find recruits for his big plans out west, and when his black Adirondack friends declined to join him, his biographers implied that they lacked agency, lacked his vision, his zest for adventure, his love of a hard choice, lacked the right stuff again. But they made their choice. They chose the difficult frontier, their hard-won communities, and their slow but steady gains on it. Historians also assume that when black names dropped from the census, grantees had jackknifed back to cities, and this certainly occurred. But archival sources tell us that several black farmers who left the gift lands actually kept right on farming elsewhere, in Malone, Westport, Virgins, Saratoga, Middlesex, Vermont, Iowa, the Dakota Territory. The cartography of Smith's plan was much more dynamic and expansive than Smith or any of the regional historians understood, and much more tenacious, too. Regional writers would insist that by the outbreak of the Civil War, the number of black families on the ground was down to 1. In fact, in 1900, 30 descendants of the Smith grantees abided in the Black Woods, and some are there today. No agency, no initiative. In 1903, a column covering a lawsuit in the New York Times revealed that as many as 400 Smith grantees had saved their deeds, not to move to the land, but for the boost the land gave them at the ballot box. We know this because they only surrendered their deeds for sale, for auction, in 1870, the year when the 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights for all black American men without regard to race or wealth. And that's when the grantees let their land deeds go. No need to keep them. The deeds had done their job. No agency. While New York dithered over organizing black regiments in the Civil War, and Massachusetts got right on it, 18-year-old Warren Morehouse, son of a Saratogian in Franklin County, took a train to Boston to enlist with the storied Massachusetts 54th. In regimental history, he would be noted for his keen work as a scout and as a sharpshooter at Boykins Mills. No agency? Tell this to Warren Morehouse's father-in-law. When John Thomas was 30, he freed himself from his Maryland enslaver and fled to Pennsylvania. Later, in upstate Troy, he took a Smith gift deed and went north to Franklin County. The Thomases would grow their farm to 200 acres and raise enough to turn a profit and generate impressive savings. He wrote about them to Gerrit Smith. He also won their neighbors' loyalty and respect, as evidenced in what those same neighbors told a county historian about a bounty hunter who came searching for this fugitive, only to discover that John Thomas was armed and waiting for him, and they would defend him too. The slave catcher peeled out. With well-earned pride, John Thomas would write Gerrit Smith in 1872, "I have breasted the storm of prejudice and opposition until I begin to be regarded as an American citizen. Heartily thanking you for the interest you have always taken in the welfare of my people and hoping to hear from you at your earliest convenience." Thomas's old patron may not have responded. Smith's archives hold no response. A few years ago, we put up a historic marker in North Elba for the vanished enclave called Timbuktu. That dedication drew about 30 people. Last spring, a second sign went up that honored the settlement called Blacksville. That occasion pulled in about 100, which was a lot more than I expected. Really pretty thrilling. A few months ago, when a stream long known by a racist moniker got a new name, John Thomas Brook, and a historic marker to explain the man who was being honored, the crowd that gathered to celebrate the change exceeded 150. Gerrit Smith may not have had the time to acknowledge Thomas's achievements, but our generation is, it seems, all in. My book ends with a quote from an Austrian historian, Hildemarie Oehl: "Every generation gets the stories it wants to hear." All over the nation, in Oklahoma, Maine, Oregon, and Michigan, 21st century historians and lay scholars are recovering the history of overlooked populations, neighborhoods, towns, and sites of migratory people too, which have gone missing in local memory and in the written record. Restoring a history of diversity is just one part of the goal here. The greater goal, of course, is justice. Maybe at long last, the history of the Blackwoods has found the generation that wants to claim it, a story it can hear. Thank you all for listening to this today. And if you have questions, I'd love to hear them. Phil, do we have time for questions?
Oh, we do, yes.
Well, someone has something. Yes, young lady.
I'm familiar with the library in Africa called Timbuktu.
Yeah.
Why is this called Timbuktu, and who named it such?
That's $1 million question, and I mean it.
Where's the money?
I don't have it because I don't know the answer. There are several readings of it. A town historian who did quite a lot of work on this assumed, because John Brown was very fond of history, that he was the one to name it. But black settlers named it too in their letters as an address. And he doesn't take credit for it. And the name Timbuktu, referencing the old African royal city that was independent, financially secure, patron to the arts, and all manner of glorious things, and full of gold, too. Newspapers, the early anti-slavery press in the early 19th century published everything it could find about exploration in Timbuktu and what people discovered there and the fate of explorers, white explorers who tried to get into it and didn't make it. And it could have easily been one of the black agents who were also conversant with black African history who might have named it. I just can't find the proof. It's just not clear. Some people assumed it was insulting as to hell and back and to Timbuktu, sort of dismissive. And yet, I don't see reason to think that, given the appreciation of it in the black reform community in the time. I think it was respectful. Also, when Adirondackers wanted to be insulting, they had other more direct ways of doing that showed up on the map, and it just doesn't make sense. They would pick a literary name if they meant to insult. Another question. Yeah.
Were you able in your research to talk to descendants of Smith?
I met them, some descendants of the Morehouse clan who had married way back with other black families there. So at a reunion of Morehouse descendants, actually 3 families of grantees were represented. And that was kind of a glorious occasion in 2005 that brought together a scattered family and old neighbors in this little town summer fair in Franklin, New York. The reunion never happened again. It was a one-off. And
Franklin County?
Franklin County, yes. And Franklin, town of Franklin is the Franklin I refer to when I speak of it in Franklin County.
There's one in Delaware County.
I know. Okay. Yeah, you mean a town of Franklin? Yeah. That can be very confusing for me at points. Yeah.
And everywhere else.
Yeah. There was a lot of effort to bring descendants into the fold of excitement and appreciation of this story. It was a little complicated in the Adirondacks. They'd been there for 100 years without any knowledge of this past legacy, and it was problematic, I sensed, for some of the descendants to grapple with this and claim it for themselves and take pride in it, which was regrettable. I think there may be a couple of people still around whose ancestry can be traced to the original grantees, but they don't like to talk about it.
And I was asking about Smith, descendants of...
Oh, you were?
Yeah.
I haven't kept up with his descendants. I'm sure he has some.
I just wondered.
Yeah. He had a son who was a phenomenal livestock breeder of Holstein cattle and revolutionized farming on that end, but that's another story. And a daughter, I think, who invented the bloomer and was very active in women's rights, and a strain of reform ran through that family for generations.
Like it.
Yeah.
Amy, you named one grantee from Waterford.
Yes.
Was he the only grantee from this county?
No, there were 45 grantees from Saratoga
Wow.
County. One, I think, came. I can give you an example, though, from Saratoga County of why someone might not have come. John Van Pelt, whose name you might have heard, who lived in Glens Falls and also in Saratoga when he got his land grant, got a grant of land and went to Canada, not to the Adirondacks, because his wife was a self-freed slave, and she was pursued by bounty hunters all the way to Glens Falls. And he got wind of this from neighbors because they came around inquiring, and they whisked north as fast as they could go north and were up there for several years before they came back. That's a good instance of why they might not have wanted to move close to the border, but not over to where it was truly safe. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
I've always been curious, all these stories I've heard about the people looking for escaped slaves. How much money did they get for finding a slave and returning it, and what's its equivalent?
It could be hundreds of dollars. I mean, that was valuable property. I mean, if someone had picked up John Thomas, he was an educated, trained, skilled person, and as viewed as his owner, as an escaped property, his children could be claimed as well and taken with him. And the courts were predisposed to favor the pro-slavery sides in these reckonings because they got more money for those cases than they did if someone was judged not enslaved and set free. For adjudicating in favor of enslavement. And yeah, it's a very loaded law when freighted entirely toward the pro-slavery side from the very idea of it. Yeah. Yeah, pretty wretched. That's it? Okay, well, thank you very much. There's good food out there.